What if everything you were taught about death was a carefully crafted illusion? Imagine that the real truth about where you go, what you become, and why it matters was hidden beneath layers of dogma, fear, and silence. You were never told that ancient texts spoke of death not as an end, but as a door to full consciousness. And the ones who knew, they were silenced, one by one. There's a reason the Vatican sealed certain scrolls for over 1,200 years. Inside them were ideas that could shatter every belief you hold about the afterlife. Ideas that connect the breath, the mind, and quantum energy in ways science is only beginning to grasp. Most people will never hear this, but you're not most people. This is not a theory. It's a wake-up call hidden in plain sight. If you've ever felt there was more, just beyond the veil, you were right. This is your moment to remember what they worked so hard to make you forget. But only if you're ready. You were never supposed to hear this. Not from a priest, not in school, not even from those who study the ancient world. Because in the year 819, a scroll was locked away beneath the Vatican, sealed, cataloged, and forgotten almost. It spoke not of sin, not of salvation, but of breath, the sacred kind. And to those who read between the lines, it didn't sound like religion. It sounded like a manual for awakening. Centuries later, that scroll was referenced in passing by Professor Mauro Biglino, a former Vatican translator who had seen things most people aren't allowed to touch. He described an entire section of early scriptures that talk about energy, not dogma, vibration, not punishment. It contradicted the very structure of organized doctrine, and that's exactly why it vanished from sight. So the question is, what kind of knowledge was so dangerous that it had to be erased from human memory? And more importantly, how did they convince us to stop asking about it? The answer begins with a concept older than any religion, the breath as a gateway. Across ancient Egypt, India, and even pre-Christian Europe, breath wasn't just for survival. It was believed to be the tether between the body and the soul, the bridge that linked us to the unseen. The Gospel of the Breath, mentioned only once in obscure fragments, described death not as an ending, but as a release, a return to the original frequency of the soul through conscious exhalation. Why would the Vatican, a place devoted to divine truth, hide such a thing? Because it bypassed hierarchy. No priest, no confession, no institution required. If a human being could connect directly with the divine through their own breath, then fear would lose its grip and control would lose its purpose. It wasn't just a threat to theology. It was a threat to power itself. And here's where it gets even stranger. In 2012, during a rare moment of access, researchers documented fragments of scrolls stored in a restricted archive beneath Vatican grounds. Among them were notations resembling pranayama practices from the Vedas, described in Latin, hidden under layers of metaphor and cautionary notes. But one phrase stood out, and it's precisely at that point that reality begins to unravel. Because this isn't just about ancient texts or lost knowledge. It's about what still lives in your body, dormant but not dead. The way your breath changes when you feel love or when you feel fear. The strange sense of stillness that follows a deep exhale, as if time itself pauses. What if that moment isn't silence, but a signal? Something is awakening, not in books, not in temples, but in you. And once you remember what they tried to erase, nothing about life or death will ever look the same again. But only if you're ready. What if death isn't what we think it is, not a full stop, but a misreading of a much subtler transition? The idea that everything ends when the body stops breathing has been drilled into us since childhood, but something about that has always felt off. People around the world have reported moments where consciousness continued even after clinical death. Is it delusion? Or are we refusing to face a truth far more complex and liberating than we imagined? One of the most unsettling theories comes from Dr. Robert Lanza, a renowned biologist who proposed that consciousness doesn't reside inside the brain, it creates reality. According to his theory of biocentrism, death is simply a shift in perspective, a detachment from a physical frame rather than an extinction. It's like turning off the screen but not the power. And if that's true, then everything we've been taught about endings might actually be about transitions. This idea isn't just poetic, it's been backed by phenomena science still struggles to explain. In 2014, Dr. Sam Parnia conducted the AWARE study, documenting cardiac arrest survivors who described scenes and conversations occurring while their brains were clinically inactive. These weren't vague hallucinations, they were verifiable accounts. One patient, flatlined for over 3 minutes, recounted exact details of his resuscitation. He should have been unconscious, but he wasn't. So where was he? This is where things get strange in ways even skeptics find hard to dismiss. Consciousness doesn't follow the neat rules biology tries to apply. In quantum physics, the observer changes the observed. At subatomic levels, matter behaves differently when it's being watched. What happens then when the ultimate observer, you, is in a state of transition, hovering between here and elsewhere? Could death be nothing more than a shift in observational frame? The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth." If consciousness isn't in the brain, if it's the very act of perception itself, then death becomes harder to define. Are we losing something, or just changing the lens through which we see? The idea that everything stops may actually be the ultimate illusion, the one belief that has kept humanity bound in fear, ritual, and silence for centuries. And yet, at the edge of that silence, something unexpected happens. People who return from near-death states often describe a moment not of darkness, but of clarity, of absolute presence. Time folds, identity dissolves, and it's precisely at that moment, when the world lets go, that something else takes over, something most of us have no words for. This isn't about what's written in textbooks or whispered in holy books. This is about the moment between one breath and the next, the moment where reality becomes fluid. Could it be that death, as we know it, is a kind of dream ending, only for us to wake up somewhere else entirely? If consciousness is the driver and the body just the vehicle, what happens when we step out of the car? That's the question no one dares to ask out loud. But deep down, a part of you has always wondered. Maybe death isn't waiting at the end. Maybe it's been moving beside you all along. Not as an ending, but as a reminder. A reminder that there's more to you than what can be measured, scanned, or buried. But only if you're ready. You were never told that early Christianity once believed in reincarnation. Not symbolically, but literally soul after soul, life after life. It wasn't a fringe idea. It was taught by saints, philosophers, and mystics. But in the 6th century, it vanished, not through debate, through decree. At the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD, the concept of multiple lives was condemned as heresy. And just like that, the story of the eternal soul was rewritten. Origen of Alexandria, one of the church's earliest theologians, taught that the soul didn't just appear at birth, it returned. Again and again, to evolve, to purify, to remember. His ideas were widespread, even respected, but they clashed with something the church was beginning to build, control. Because if your soul came back by its own rhythm, learning over lifetimes, then sin, punishment, and eternal damnation lost their power. You didn't need saving. You needed remembering. This wasn't unique to Origen. Plato spoke of the soul's descent into the body as a kind of sleep, with life as the process of waking up again. Pythagoras claimed to remember his past lives in detail. In India and Tibet, the belief was never questioned. It was integrated into spiritual practice. But when the Roman Church aligned itself with imperial power, everything changed. The soul could no longer be free. It had to be judged, and judged only once. Think about the emotional weight that idea carries. One life, one chance, one mistake, and you burn forever. Fear became a moral leash, and where fear enters, curiosity dies. But across the centuries, the memory of past lives kept flickering in secret writings, in whispered visions, in the silent certainty some people carry that this life is not their first, that they've loved before, lost before, chosen before. In 1982, psychiatrist Dr. Brian Weiss accidentally uncovered past life memories during hypnotherapy. His patient, Catherine began describing names and dates from ancient eras, one she had no way of knowing. At first, he was skeptical. Then she spoke about his own father, recently deceased, giving information no one else had. It shattered his worldview, and he's not alone. Thousands have now come forward with similar stories, not as fantasy, as lived experience. But this isn't about memory. It's about accountability. Because if the soul returns, if we carry the imprints of past decisions, then what are we really healing in this life? Whose pain are we carrying? Whose choices are echoing through our current relationships, our traumas, our inexplicable fears? And it's precisely at that point, when you stop asking who you are and start asking what you've always been, that everything shifts. The soul, unbound by time, begins to trace its own lineage, not through blood, but through vibration. The way you're drawn to certain people, the places that feel oddly familiar, the dreams that don't feel like dreams. And suddenly, life isn't linear anymore. It loops, it returns, it teaches. And you're no longer here to survive or obey, but to awaken. Not once, many times. You've been here before. You felt it in moments you couldn't explain. That strange déjà vu, that pull toward a language you've never studied. A grief that doesn't belong to this life. Something in you has always known this isn't your first time. The question is, what did you forget before you came back? And more importantly, what are you finally ready to remember now? But only if you're ready. You've heard of the Vatican as a religious empire, but few realize it also hides one of the most secretive scientific archives on Earth. Deep beneath its marble floors, behind vaults marked in Latin, lies a treasure trove of knowledge that spans astronomy, alchemy, and early physics. And at the heart of it, texts written by Jesuit scholars long before the word quantum ever existed, describing consciousness as the engine of reality itself. The Jesuits were more than priests. They were astronomers, mathematicians, linguists, and mystics. In the 1600s, they operated the most advanced observatories in Europe. But what they recorded in private writings was far stranger than stars and planetary motion. Some journals, now stored in the Vatican Library's restricted section, describe divine perception collapsing matter, a phrase disturbingly similar to what physicists now call wave function collapse. In simple terms, observation creates reality. One particular document, written by a Jesuit named Father Matteo Ricci, describes the invisible field of divine thought shaping the world of form. His wording mirrors what modern quantum physicist John Wheeler called the participatory universe, where the observer is not passive, but a co-creator. How did Ricci describe a concept 400 years ago that quantum science would only begin to understand in the 20th century? Was it revelation, or was it access? Access to something older, something hidden. The Church has always absorbed wisdom from the traditions it conquered. Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalah, Eastern cosmology, all tucked discreetly beneath Christian symbols. In private, some Vatican scholars were reportedly trained in ancient texts that described consciousness as the light that animates geometry. These weren't metaphors. They were formulas disguised as prayers. Modern science, too, is catching up. The double-slit experiment revealed something astonishing. Particles behave differently when observed. Reality responds to awareness. Nobel Prize winning physicist Eugene Wigner even stated that consciousness must be involved in shaping the outcome of physical events. What's shocking isn't that science found this, it's that it was written centuries ago by men in robes, protected by silence. But it goes deeper. According to former Vatican insider Father Malachi Martin, some of the Jesuits' private writings warned against manipulating observation without spiritual grounding. In other words, they believed accessing these quantum realities without moral clarity could tear open something we're not prepared to handle. And it's precisely at that point, where science brushes against spirit, that their silence begins to make sense. If observation creates form, then your thoughts matter more than you were ever told. If perception bends reality, then belief becomes architecture. And if your consciousness is part of a larger, intelligent field, then perhaps death, time, and space are not boundaries, but illusions. The Vatican may have guarded this not to protect the truth, but to protect control over the truth. You weren't meant to stay blind to your own creative power. You were conditioned to believe in hierarchy, not resonance. But the signs are everywhere now. The science, the ancient texts, the feelings you've had since childhood but couldn't explain. Something in you is waking up, and it's not because you're learning. It's because you're finally remembering. But only if you're ready. There's a moment most people will never witness. A silence that stretches just beyond the final heartbeat, where the body lies still, but something else lingers. For centuries, this in-between space, between life and death, was assumed to be empty. Just the last echo before darkness. But today, science is beginning to say something very different. What if consciousness doesn't shut down at the moment of death, but slips into another state entirely? In 2014, Dr. Sam Parnia led a groundbreaking study known as AWARE. He and his team interviewed patients who had suffered cardiac arrest and were declared clinically dead. No heartbeat, no brain activity, no oxygen. And yet, some of them returned with detailed, verifiable memories of what happened while they were supposedly gone. One man described watching doctors work on his body from above. He recalled conversations, specific instruments, even a machine noise that matched hospital records. So where exactly was his awareness? The medical explanation struggles here. When the brain shuts down, memory formation should stop. Experience should end. But cases like these are piling up. And not just in clinical studies. Neurosurgeon Dr. Evan Alexander, once a complete skeptic, contracted a rare illness that shut down his neocortex. While in a coma, he experienced what he described as a realm beyond time, a place so vivid, so coherent, that he claimed it couldn't have come from a dying brain. When he recovered, his entire worldview collapsed, or maybe expanded. There's something curious happening with the pineal gland, too. The mysterious organ long linked to the soul in ancient traditions. In Brazil, Dr. Sergio Felipe de Oliveira found that people who reported spiritual experiences had abnormal concentrations of tiny crystals in this gland. These crystals, like miniature antennas, may respond to electromagnetic frequencies. Could it be that the soul doesn't leave the body after death, but tunes itself out of physical perception? And if so, what are we really experiencing at the edge of death? Is it the end of the self or the beginning of the self, unfiltered by biology? Some spiritual traditions believe the moment after death is the most lucid a soul can be. Tibetan monks teach that the mind, when released from the body, becomes like a mirror, reflecting pure reality without distortion. And perhaps that's why some people, even after returning from death, come back completely changed. But not all of them return the same. Some speak of crossing a threshold they weren't meant to find. Others mention being shown things, truths that shattered their old beliefs. And it's precisely at that point, in the stillness where no monitors beep and no breath rises, that something else begins to stir. You were told that the brain creates consciousness, like a machine produces sound. But what if the brain is just a receiver and consciousness, the signal? What if death doesn't stop that signal, only detunes it from this frequency? That means you are not your body, not your thoughts, not your memories. You are something that can't be measured in vital signs, something that watches even after the eyes close. This isn't just philosophy. It's your reality waiting behind every heartbeat. And once you truly understand that who you are is not limited to flesh, the fear of death begins to dissolve. What replaces it isn't just comfort. It's power, but only if you're ready. Imagine walking blindfolded into a stone chamber lit only by flickering flames. Your heartbeat echoes off the walls. Around you, silence. Then a voice says, "Let go of who you were, or you'll never remember who you are." This wasn't death. It was initiation. A ritual practice for thousands of years, not to scare, but to awaken. Because in the ancient mystery schools of Egypt and Greece, death wasn't feared. It was rehearsed. To them, dying wasn't an end, but a rite of passage. Initiates were symbolically buried, sometimes even placed in coffins or underground chambers, guided through the dark by sacred words and breath. Why? Because they believed only by facing death could a person truly live. This process, repeated in Eleusis, in Luxor, in forgotten temples buried beneath the Vatican's very foundations, aimed to break the illusion of separation between body and spirit. Death was not punishment, it was clarity. Modern psychology stumbled onto this same concept through another door. Carl Jung, during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, recorded visions of his own symbolic death. He later wrote in the Red Book that this inner death was the moment he stopped being a shadow of others and began living from the self. For Jung, true transformation came only when the ego dissolved. Sound familiar? In today's world, something curious is happening. The same themes of symbolic death are being revisited, not in temples, but in clinical settings. At Johns Hopkins, psilocybin is being used to simulate ego death. Patients facing terminal illness undergo controlled experiences where they feel their identity collapse, only to emerge weeks later with less fear, more peace, and a sense of connection to something beyond logic. It's not just a trip, it's a rebirth. The strange part? When researchers asked these patients to describe the experience, the words they used matched the ancient texts. Light, silence, vastness, presence. How could people across time and culture describe the same death without ever meeting? Unless they were all tapping into something deeper, something older than belief, a reality beneath the skin of this one. But there's one detail the mystery schools always warned about. Not everyone who enters this death comes back the same. Some return shaken, others don't return at all. And it's precisely at that moment, when the veil lifts and you forget your name, that the illusion of separation begins to dissolve. So maybe death isn't what ends your story. Maybe it's the moment you drop the story entirely. Maybe you've already experienced tiny deaths, heartbreaks, awakenings, ego cracks that change your whole direction. What if those moments weren't breaking you, but preparing you, initiating you? There's a door within you that opens only when you stop clinging to who you were. And that door is silence. Beyond it is something no doctrine can describe and no priest can lead you to. But it's always been there, waiting, but only if you're ready. There's a reason the idea of sin feels heavier than any other word in human language. It doesn't just describe behavior, it binds identity. From the moment we're old enough to understand punishment, we're told we were born wrong. That something in us needs cleansing, correction, forgiveness. But what if that weight you've been carrying isn't yours at all? What if the very concept of sin was created not to free your soul, but to imprison it? In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, the Catholic Church made confession mandatory. This wasn't just a spiritual recommendation, it became law. Suddenly, your inner world was no longer private. Every desire, doubt, or deviation had to be filtered through an intermediary. One life, one chance, one authority to tell you if you were worthy. And in return, obedience. Guilt became currency. And fear, the priesthood's most powerful tool. But psychology tells a different story. Neuropsychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett explains that emotions like guilt aren't objective, they're constructed. Repeated enough, they become predictive patterns, shaping how your brain anticipates and interprets every future experience. In other words, if you've been conditioned to see yourself as sinful, your brain begins to expect suffering, even when you've done nothing wrong, especially then. Former bishop and theologian John Shelby Spong dared to say it plainly. Hell was invented by the church to control, not to enlighten. And this isn't just theory. On Reddit, a woman shared how, after leaving Catholicism, she stopped confessing sins and instead began keeping a gratitude journal. Within 2 months, her panic attacks disappeared. Not because she found God outside the church, but because she stopped believing she was broken inside. The deeper danger is not sin itself, but the story it tells you, that you are not enough, that your natural instincts, your curiosity, your rawness are flaws. But ancient spiritual traditions believed the opposite. The Gnostics, once labeled heretics, taught that the soul's path is inward, not upward, that the divine lives not in obeying, but in remembering. Sin, to them, was ignorance of self, not disobedience to rules. And yet, there's something the church never taught in Sunday school. The Latin root of the word sin, peccatum, doesn't mean evil. It means to miss the mark, like an archer adjusting their aim. So what if sin isn't a stain on your soul, but a call to recalibrate your path? And what if the guilt you've carried wasn't divine justice, but spiritual gaslighting? Because once you realize you were never born unworthy, a strange thing happens. Your shame begins to lift. Your choices become conscious. And it's precisely at that moment, when you stop apologizing for existing, that the entire system that fed off your fear begins to crack. So the question isn't whether you've sinned. It's whether the idea of sin ever belonged to you in the first place. Maybe what you thought was guilt was actually intuition, suffocating under rules you never agreed to. And maybe freedom doesn't come from being forgiven. Maybe it comes from remembering that there was never anything to be forgiven for. But only if you're ready. There are moments that freeze time. You dream of someone who's passed, only to wake up to the news that they're gone. A song plays on the radio at the exact moment you think of them. A whisper in the mind, a flicker in the room, a feeling in the chest that you can't explain. We call it coincidence, or grief, or fantasy. But what if it's none of those things? What if the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than we were told? Science has always been uneasy with the invisible. Yet at the University of Arizona, the Veritas research program dared to study it anyway. They examined mediums who claimed to communicate with the dead, testing them under double-blind conditions. The results? Strangely accurate. Names, dates, private memories, messages that brought closure. It wasn't entertainment. It was data, and it hinted at something we still don't understand. That consciousness may survive and reach back. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious, a realm beneath waking thought, where symbols, memories, and energies intertwine. He believed that death didn't erase identity. It folded it into this deeper field, a place where archetypes and ancestors coexist, where the dream you had wasn't just a dream, but a doorway. He wrote, "The dead live on in the soul, and their whisper is not memory, it is presence." And the whispers are becoming louder. On Facebook, in grief support groups, stories repeat with uncanny similarity. People waking from dreams moments before their loved ones passing. Children speaking of relatives they never met with unsettling precision. In one post, a woman described receiving a message in a dream from her father saying, "Don't worry about the watch." The next day, her mother found his missing watch behind the headboard. He'd passed years before. Is it delusion? Or is it our modern mind refusing to accept what the ancient world once embraced? Across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and beyond, cultures believe the dead communicate through wind, animals, thoughts, dreams. Not metaphorically, literally, not as horror, but as guidance. In these traditions, to ignore such signs wasn't skepticism. It was amnesia. And maybe that amnesia isn't natural. Maybe it's trained. Because if you truly believed your ancestors could reach you, not through rituals, but through intuition, what else might you begin to hear? And it's precisely at that moment, when silence starts to feel like a message, you begin to wonder if the line between this world and the next was never meant to be so clear. So perhaps the question isn't, are the dead trying to speak? Maybe the better question is, are you quiet enough to hear them? Because what we call imagination might be memory. What we call coincidence might be a signal. And what you've dismissed as wishful thinking might be someone, somewhere reaching back. But only if you're ready. Deep inside your brain, there's a tiny gland no bigger than a grain of rice. The ancients called it the seat of the soul. In sacred art, it's symbolized as a radiant eye, the bridge between the physical and the unseen. Today, science calls it the pineal gland. And while textbooks reduce it to a melatonin regulator, forgotten manuscripts and modern studies whisper a very different truth. This gland may be your antenna to the divine. And someone, somewhere, has gone to great lengths to switch it off. In the 1990s, British scientist Dr. Jennifer Luke discovered something unsettling. In all her tissue samples, fluoride, the same substance added to public drinking water, wasn't accumulating in the bones or teeth as expected. It was concentrating in the pineal gland, more than anywhere else in the body. Her findings, buried in obscure journals, suggested that this exposure calcifies the gland, limiting its function and disrupting the body's natural rhythms. Why was no one talking about it? This isn't fringe theory. Fluoride's neurological effects have been documented in over 50 studies, some of which link it to cognitive decline. But while the media debates dental benefits, very few discuss what happens spiritually when your inner compass is dulled. Ancient cultures saw the pineal gland as the third eye, a point of access to higher awareness, visions, even contact with other dimensions. What happens when that gateway is chemically blocked? In Brazil, Dr. Sergio Felipe de Oliveira, both a physician and a researcher, studied the pineal glands of individuals who reported spiritual sensitivity. Many of them had unusual pineal activity and crystalline formations that, according to him, functioned like biological receivers. These people weren't sick. They were intuitive. He proposed that the gland picks up non-physical frequencies, subtle signals from beyond ordinary perception. If true, then dulling the pineal isn't just a health issue. It's spiritual interference. But here's where it becomes personal. A case emerged on Instagram in 2021. A yoga teacher from Sao Paulo shared her experience detoxifying her pineal gland through diet, meditation, and fluoride elimination. Weeks into the process, she began having spontaneous lucid dreams, including recurring visions of places she'd never visited. One location turned out to be a real monastery in northern India. She'd never seen it before, but described it in perfect detail. So the question lingers, why has this gland been ignored in modern education, but revered in ancient mystery schools? Why is it that in art from Egypt to the Vatican, we see pine cone symbols, direct representations of the pineal, at the center of spiritual architecture? And why, in a world obsessed with surveillance and control, is one of our only natural tools for direct connection to the divine chemically clouded? Because the truth isn't just in the body. It's in the silence between thoughts, the pull towards something more, the feeling that you're not just thinking, but being guided. And it's precisely at that moment, when you ask yourself, is this me or something speaking through me, that the conspiracy begins to crack. They don't need to ban the third eye. They only need to make you forget it was ever real. But what if the tingling in your forehead during meditation isn't random? What if the pressure between your eyes is the beginning of reactivation? The gateway was never closed. It was only coated in layers of distraction. And now it's waking up. But only if you're ready. In the 1970s, inside a classified US military base, a psychic sat in a dark room and described with eerie precision a Soviet submarine thousands of miles away. Not from photos, not from intelligence reports, but from his mind. This wasn't a movie plot. It was part of a real program called Stargate, backed by the CIA. And while the headlines focused on spying, the hidden reports revealed something much stranger. Remote viewers weren't just seeing across space, they were reaching into the space beyond death. One of the program's pioneers, Ingo Swann, stunned researchers by describing the surface of Jupiter in 1973, details later confirmed by NASA. But what caught the agency off guard was what these remote viewers began reporting when they accidentally tuned into non-physical realms. They described encountering presences, fields of consciousness, entities that didn't belong to Earth's dimension. The question quickly became uncomfortable. Were they seeing too much? These weren't delusions. CIA documents now available to the public, declassified in 2003, show that remote viewers were occasionally sent to observe deceased individuals. Not metaphorically, literally. In one report, a viewer was tasked with finding a missing agent believed to be dead. What they described was not a corpse, but a conscious essence in transition. The language in these documents is clinical, restrained. But between the lines, something stirs, the suggestion that consciousness doesn't end. It relocates. Modern neuroscience might offer a clue. Studies on theta brainwaves, the same waves activated in deep meditation, sleep, and near-death experiences, show that in these states, perception detaches from sensory input. The body sleeps, but awareness travels. Remote viewers were trained to reach this state at will. What if this altered state was not an escape from reality, but a different layer of it? One that becomes more accessible the closer we come to physical death. Even stranger, some remote viewers claim to encounter souls in waiting, conscious beings between incarnations. They describe timeless spaces, luminous forms, and what one document vaguely called intelligent fields. No doctrine, no halos, just presence. Could these be the same beings of light described by people who temporarily died in hospital beds? The overlap is too direct to ignore. And it's precisely at that moment, when spies and mystics describe the same realm, that belief begins to blur with proof. One report ends with a line scribbled in the margin. Subjects may be interacting with dimensional constructs beyond operational relevance. It sounds like bureaucratic language, but what it really means is this. They saw something they weren't ready to understand. Or worse, they did understand it, and chose silence. You weren't supposed to hear about Stargate, or theta waves, or remote encounters with the non-incarnate. But now the veil is thinning. The data is out. And what it points to isn't just a secret program, but a suppressed truth. The mind is not locked inside the body. The soul is not bound to a tomb. And when the systems of power start studying the afterlife behind closed doors, it's not curiosity. It's fear of what they can't control. But only if you're ready. What if the moment you were born, you already knew how it would end? Not as punishment, not as fate, but as agreement. A soul-level decision made before your first breath. It's a concept whispered across spiritual traditions, resurfacing now with unexpected clarity, the soul contract theory. The idea that before entering this life, your soul chose its path, including the exit. It sounds impossible, but what if the deeper impossibility is that it's not? Dr. Michael Newton, a regression therapist with over 7,000 documented cases, uncovered something startling. While guiding patients through hypnosis, not just to past lives, but to the space between lives, they began speaking of meetings, councils, moments where souls chose the lives to come, the lessons to learn, and sometimes the pain to endure. One patient described selecting parents, illness, even the moment of death, not for masochism, but for growth. Growth she wouldn't understand until much later. These aren't just symbolic metaphors. In one case documented by Newton, a woman who had battled cancer from childhood recalled, under hypnosis, agreeing to that exact path in her soul planning session. Why? To teach her mother empathy, to awaken forgiveness in someone still trapped in bitterness. That same mother, present at the session, broke down sobbing, not in guilt, but in recognition. It wasn't random. It was chosen, together. The German philosopher Schopenhauer once wrote, "A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." What if that unconscious pull we feel, the strange magnetism towards some people, the instinct to avoid others, the grief that seems too big for this life, isn't random? What if it's memory, not of this lifetime, but of a deeper one, where everything was understood and everything was agreed? Across indigenous cultures, echoes of this belief remain. The Zulu speak of a moya, a breath spirit that follows the soul's map. Tibetan lamas often describe their own deaths decades before they occur, calling them returns. Even in the West, we hear it in whispers. Children who speak of events before birth, strangers who feel instantly familiar, dreams that predict endings with uncanny accuracy. Not premonitions, agreements unfolding. But if we chose our death, does that mean tragedy is meaningless? Or that it's more meaningful than we can possibly grasp? This is where the soul contract theory stops sounding comforting and starts becoming transformative, because it means pain has purpose. Even loss may be a collaboration. And it's precisely at that moment, when you stop asking why me and start asking why this, that the question flips the light on. This doesn't mean you're not allowed to grieve. It doesn't mean every loss was painless. But it might mean that on some level, the soul knew. The soul prepared. And the soul remembered. Death, in this light, is not something that happens to you. It's something that happens through you. A doorway chosen. A story closing on its own perfect sentence. But only if you're ready. At some point in history, the sacred became profitable. Death, once a mystery to be honored, slowly turned into a market. A product. A business fueled not by truth, but by fear. Fear of the unknown, of punishment, of eternal consequence? What if you were told your soul's future depended on payment, obedience, submission? For over 1,000 years, the afterlife hasn't just been preached, it's been sold. In the 15th century, the Catholic Church began selling indulgences, official documents claiming to reduce your time in purgatory. The message was simple: salvation has a price. For the poor, it was despair. For the rich, a loophole. And underneath this doctrine, something deeper took root. The belief that your freedom was not your own. That your peace in the afterlife could be bought, or worse, taken away. The same manipulation plays out today. The funeral industry, worth billions, thrives on people's pain. Life insurance ads trigger fear of leaving loved ones behind. Religious figures offer exclusive entry to heaven. If you follow the rules, pay the fees, or join the flock. It's no longer about spiritual truth. It's emotional extortion. Because when you fear what comes after, you can be led anywhere. And here's what most don't know. Studies in evolutionary psychology show that fear of death increases susceptibility to fundamentalism. The more afraid people are, the more rigidly they cling to ideologies. Terror management theory, tested in dozens of experiments, reveals that even subtle reminders of mortality cause people to defend their beliefs more aggressively. Fear of death doesn't just paralyze, it programs. So who benefits from keeping you afraid? Who profits when you doubt your own inner compass? Philosopher Krishnamurti once said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And in a society where death is distorted into punishment and heaven is locked behind someone else's gate, perhaps the sickness is spiritual amnesia, forgetting that no one can sell you what's already yours. But what if the afterlife isn't a prize or a punishment? What if it's simply the next page in a story your soul already knows how to read? And it's precisely at that moment, when you realize your fear has been a product manufactured and sold, that the entire structure begins to crumble. You were not born with fear of death. You were taught it, shaped by centuries of systems that traded mystery for obedience. But once you start seeing fear as currency, you also begin to see freedom as your inheritance. Not earned, not given, already present, but only if you're ready. Not every death comes with a coffin. Some happen in silence, in stillness, in the middle of an ordinary day. A moment when the person you thought you were slips away. No heartbeat stops, no breath fades, but something within you shatters and you're never the same again. This is what mystics call ego death. And to those who've experienced it, the message is clear. The most profound afterlife might happen while you're still alive. Dr. Stanislav Grof, a pioneer in transpersonal psychology, spent decades studying altered states of consciousness. Through LSD sessions and later with holotropic breathwork, he discovered that many participants described the same sequence: dissolution of identity, confrontation with deep fear, then a feeling of expansion so vast it transcended space and time. It wasn't a metaphor. It was described as a death and rebirth of the self. One U.S. Marine, featured in The Wisdom of Trauma with Dr. Gabor Mate, shared how a guided ayahuasca session forced him to confront the version of himself that had survived war, but not life. He died in that vision, his ego stripped, his stories exposed. And in that collapse, he met a presence he called truth. Not external, not divine, just real. When he returned, his trauma hadn't vanished, but it had loosened, because the version of him holding onto the pain was gone. Buddhism teaches that what we call self is just a process, a bundle of attachments, habits, fears. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol describes the moment after death as a mirror, the raw truth of consciousness without form. But what if we can access that space now? If the self is only a mask, then removing it doesn't require dying. Just courage. Courage to face what's underneath. Neuroscience gives this an unexpected lens. Brain scans of people in deep meditation or under psychedelics show a decrease in default mode network activity, the very region tied to identity and narrative. As that activity drops, people report unity, stillness, and a sense of being everything and nothing at once. Sound familiar? It's not death of the body, it's death of the illusion. But ego death isn't gentle. It strips, burns, exposes. And it's precisely at that moment, when you're standing in the ashes of who you thought you were, that something vast begins to rise. Something not shaped by fear, past, or name. Something ancient that was always waiting underneath. So maybe the afterlife isn't elsewhere. Maybe it's beneath. Beneath the layers of protection, opinion, identity. And crossing into it doesn't require losing the body, only the mask. Because when the ego dies, what's left is an emptiness. It's presence, unfiltered, pure. And the question that remains is not, will I survive death? But am I brave enough to survive myself? But only if you're ready. What if the world you see, the colors, the faces, the rules, is just one frequency? One channel on a vast, invisible dial? From birth, we're tuned into this station. Reality as solid, predictable, measurable. But what if that tuning is not the full range? What if death is not a disappearance, but a simple shift to another station, one that's been playing all along, just outside your perception? Nikola Tesla once said, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. He wasn't speaking poetically. Modern physics shows us that everything, objects, thoughts, even your body, is vibrating energy. What appears solid is mostly empty space, held together by invisible forces. So if your body is a receiver, what determines what you experience? The answer may be your frequency. In 2014, researchers at Kyoto University observed that the human brain, under specific conditions like sensory deprivation or deep meditation, begins producing strange patterns of electromagnetic coherence. Participants reported experiences of timelessness, encounters with radiant forms, even awareness of other presences in the room. Science couldn't verify the visitors, but it couldn't explain the patterns either. The brain was tuning in to something else. This is not new to ancient traditions. The Vedic texts describe lokas, realms of existence vibrating at different frequencies. The Kabbalistic tree of life speaks of ascending through levels of awareness. In 2001, Tibetan monks began working with terminal patients, placing them in sound domes, resonant chambers where chants and frequencies surrounded the body. Some patients reported crossing over with a sense of guidance, as if the sounds were tuning their soul toward the next dimension. Even near-death experiences hint at this shift. People often describe vibrations just before leaving the body, or a hum that surrounds the tunnel of light. They speak of colors not found on Earth, a sense of being weightless, not in body, but in perception. What if they weren't hallucinating? What if they simply changed the station? And here's where it sharpens. If death is a frequency shift, then so is awakening. Every mystical state, every glimpse of higher consciousness, every unexplainable synchronicity might not be a miracle, but a momentary retuning. And it's precisely at that moment, when reality starts to shimmer and logic can't keep up, that the veil begins to flicker. You weren't meant to stay trapped in one vibration forever. Your sadness, your fear, your restlessness might not be flaws. They could be signals, echoes from the deeper channels of your being, calling you back to your natural resonance. Because this reality, as real as it seems, is just one note in a cosmic chord. And maybe, just maybe, you've already felt the other notes. In dreams that felt more real than waking. In the pull toward places you've never been. In the way certain sounds, colors, or silences make you feel like you're remembering something long forgotten. You're not imagining it. You're retuning, but only if you're ready. There's a Trinity older than the church. It isn't Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but breath, light, and sound. Found in ancient temples, etched into forgotten scrolls, and hidden within chants that still echo in Himalayan caves. These three elements were once known as the keys to transcendence. They weren't metaphors. They were instructions. And although religions across time spoke of them, only one institution systematically removed them from public reach: the Vatican. The Gospel of Thomas, unearthed near Nag Hammadi in 1945, contains a strange line: split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift a stone and you will find me. No commands, no rituals, just perception. The early mystics knew divinity wasn't distant. It was in vibration, in breath, in the inner light behind closed eyes. But these teachings were quickly labeled heresy because they taught that sacred experience required no church, only presence. In Catholic cathedrals, the architecture still remembers. Choirs chant in specific frequencies. Light filters through stained glass in measured hues. Incense moves with the breath of the congregation. It's all still there, hidden in plain sight. But no one tells you what it means. Because if you knew that breath can shift your brainwaves, that sound can rewire your emotional body, that light, perceived inwardly, can unlock altered states of consciousness, then salvation would no longer be a product, it would be an inner state. Modern research now confirms what mystics always knew. Breath work, specifically coherent breathing, alters your heart rhythm and nervous system, bringing you into a state of clarity and expanded awareness. Certain frequencies, like the solfeggio tones, have been shown to synchronize hemispheres of the brain. And experiments in light-induced neural entrainment are now being used to simulate meditative states in seconds. This isn't spirituality versus science. It's spirituality through science. Yet, despite these findings, the church has remained curiously silent. Why? Because these practices don't need an altar. They don't require intermediaries. They remind you that the divine lives in the rhythm of your lungs, the stillness behind your eyes, the vibration of your own voice. They free you from seeking. And institutions don't survive when people stop searching for what they've already found within. What's even more mysterious is this. Dying people across cultures report 3 consistent sensations: a shift in breath, a tunnel of light, and an ethereal sound. They aren't fed these images. They simply experience them. From Japan to Peru, from hospital beds to mountaintops, the transition begins with the same triad. Could it be that death isn't the end, but the crescendo of a symphony you've been playing all along? And it's precisely at that point, when breath softens, light brightens, and sound becomes silence, that the door opens. Not above, not beyond, but within. You've been taught to look outward for signs of the sacred, but the real signs were woven into your body from the beginning. A breath that centers, a light that reveals, a sound that vibrates through bone and memory. The secret was never buried. It was only quieted. Now it's rising again, but only if you're ready.